I'm the Chief Historian, Air Force Life Cycle Management Center. If any of you have been around the Air Force Base for a long time, we're what used to be the systems centers. We manage the acquisition of all of the stuff that the Air Force uses, mainly all the airplanes, but we also do the electronics, computer systems, vehicles, weapons, all of that stuff got rolled into the Air Force Life Cycle Management Center back in 2012. Well, we're headquartered here at Wright, Pat. I do a lot of base history, I do a lot of acquisition history, I like to do a lot of history of technology, I do a lot of local history as it pertains to what we do here at Wright, Pat, because it's all intertwined. The base wouldn't be there if it weren't for airplanes. Well, the airplanes wouldn't be here if it weren't for Dayton and the Wright brothers, all that good stuff. So all those threads get together. So when trying to talk about part of our history, and today I'm just talking about a very small part of our history, kind of the earliest days of that, it's kind of hard to pick and choose what to talk about because there is so much stuff. Just like now, we did a lot of stuff back in the 19-teens and 1920s. So I picked some of the highlights for you, hopefully give you an overview of kind of the scope of the responsibilities of what we did at the beginning. Some of the highlights as well, some of the kind of cool stories, and there were a lot of cool stories, a lot of cool people there, and basically how it fed into the kind of stuff we do today. With that said, I entitled this, Forging the Future of Flight, Dayton's McCook Field and the Making of Modern Aviation. You can probably tell I like alliteration. I call this Forging the Future of Flight because that's what we did. When I say we, I mean our predecessors at McCook Field. In just 10 years that they were open, they really shaped modern aviation. They took it from this sort of wood, cloth, biplane sort of era into metal airplanes that could fly tens of thousands of feet, could fly across the country, could fly across the ocean, could carry weapons and bombs and all of that stuff. Not that we invented all of that, but we brought those pieces together, we accelerated those technologies, we made all of these things possible. All these kind of planes that you may remember from, if you're a World War II history buff, something like that, all of those airplanes, all those capabilities you saw during World War II wouldn't have been possible if it weren't for these guys doing their work back in the 19-teens and 1920s. So it's not an exaggeration to say that they really did help make modern flight. And in my opinion, I'm a little biased because I'm the relevant historian there. But I really think it's kind of difficult to find another organization anywhere in the world that had as much of an impact on aviation development in that time period as McCook Field did. So let's keep that in mind. The time period we're going to be talking about is just a decade, but we're going to get to that in a minute. How many people are from Dayton or lived here a good chunk of your life? All right, now put your hand down if you haven't heard of the Wright brothers. I think pretty much if you've been in Dayton for more than about, say, 15 minutes, you've heard of the Wright brothers. You know they're from Dayton. We're very proud of that history, our kind of role in world events. In my opinion, if you're talking about aviation, of course, everything comes back to the Wright brothers. So I can't do a history of pretty much anything we do without talking about the Wright brothers. I don't want to assume you guys know too much about them, so just a quick overview. Wright brothers, art and science of aeronautics. So we've all probably seen this picture. This is Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. I don't like to say that too loudly because we all know they were from Dayton. They weren't from Kitty Hawk. Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, December 17th, 1903, made the first man-powered controlled flight. Pretty short, 120 feet, 12 seconds of flight. Not that impressive. If that's all they had done, people would still be arguing today that they didn't really make the first flight. But over the next couple of days, they flew a few more times and they flew over 800 feet at their longest flight before they decided to pack up and come back to Dayton. Here's our two most famous Daytonians. That's Orville right up at the top. Here's his older brother, Wilbur, down here in the corner. So, Wright brothers. But did it start in 1903? Of course not. It started several years earlier than that, in the late 1890s. The Wright brothers got interested in aviation like a lot of people of their generation. It was one of those things, part of this sort of era of technological enthusiasm. This was kind of on the heels of electricity, the telephone, telegraph, steam engines, trains, all of these things kind of happening in the 19th century, leading up to the 20th century. Aviation was kind of seen as the next great front of that. It's like, you kind of want to think of it as like, AI is now. It's like, hey, there's all this possibility. So the Wright brothers, the question we get asked a lot when I go talk to engineers and stuff is, why did they figure out the airplane and nobody else did? If you study the history of aviation, there were a lot of really smart guys working on aviation that had various pieces of it. There was a lot of science going on. They were figuring out all of these chunks, but nobody was successfully able to fly. A lot of people crashed, a lot of people tried, a few people died, but then you get these two guys, that everybody says, well, they're just these kind of tinker bicycle mechanics. They made it happen. How did that happen? Well, it turns out there's a little bit more to them than meets the eye. Unlike a lot of people, they didn't just try to rush ideas into the field and say, hey, I got a great idea for an airplane. Go build an airplane, pay some poor schmuck to fly it, watch him crash and possibly kill himself. They were going to be patient. They were going to be methodical, follow the scientific method. That's what they did. They decided to go and really be diligent about this. They weren't going to look at one piece of the airplane. They were going to look at all the pieces of the airplane and try to put them together like a puzzle. And that's where they were successful, where everybody else was not. They were going to go break apart the picture into these individual components, research them, figure out how to make them work, and put them back together in a package that made sense. So their first step was to do research. They wrote to the Smithsonian. That was the bastion of knowledge of science in America. We didn't have a great university system at that time. We had a handful of Harvard and that kind of stuff, but otherwise, so they wrote to the one bastion of science there, the Smithsonian, said, hey, we're interested if you can read any of this. We've been studying, George Cayley and these other guys doing aeronautics for a while. Send us any information you have on aeronautics. Great, so they did that. So they studied. They didn't just start from scratch. They built test facilities. They needed to test stuff. They realized, hey, if you're going to stay in the air, you need something that's going to provide lift to get you up off the ground. Wings, airfoils, whatever term you want to use. They needed to study those. So they used other people's aerodynamic data. It turned out to not really work well for them, and they didn't understand why. Either they weren't too smart, or they weren't smart enough to figure it out, or else they misinterpreted it, or maybe the original data was wrong because people didn't really do this same, try it out in the wind tunnels and take practical measurements. It was more theoretical. So they went ahead, designed and built their own wind tunnel, yes, in their bicycle shop, downtown Dayton. In that sense, yeah, bicycle tinkerers, but they were using their mechanical knowledge. So they built a wind tunnel to test airplane shapes, to see how much lift they provide, so they could come up with a more efficient wings shape, so that way it could get them up in the air for less weight. Secondly, they did a lot of flight tests, a lot of experimentation. They flew first kites, then they flew gliders, and that's what you see here. They took them out to the sands. They did a little bit of this in Indiana. They did some of it at Kitty Hawk once they had this sort of full glider design. They took them out there and they tried, because that way they're testing just one component. First, they're just testing those airfoil shapes. Well, they worked in the wind tunnel. We got some good math here. What happens if we make these full size, turn it into a glider? Is it providing enough lift to carry a man, to carry an engine, all of that? That came through this experimentation that they did. Other people weren't taking these steps. They were kind of skipping right to the end. It's like going to the last chapter of the book and seeing how it ends without going in the middle. That's also where they were developing their control system. And this is, if you want to give the Wright brothers credit for one thing, it's figuring out control of an airplane. Everybody else was trying to get an airplane up into the air, go in a straight line and stay there. Nice and stable. If you've ever flown a small airplane, it's something you can let go of the controls, it's going to fly straight. The Wright brothers, what did I say their occupation was? Bicycle mechanics, right? They had bicycle shops, they built bicycles. How many here like to ride bikes? Yeah, a lot of people, right? So if you're riding a bike, do you just sit on your bike and it goes in a straight line, or you sit there and you don't fall over? No, of course not. If you're not moving, the bicycle falls over. Even if you're pedaling along, the bicycle, you're having to do a lot of these constant motions to keep it upright, to go it straight, right? It's not just, hey, everything's hands off and I go. No, it's like your body is doing all these sort of inherent motions to keep it stable. The Wright brothers applied that to the airplane. They realized, hey, we're not going to design something that's what we call inherently stable, meaning that it's going to go up there and just go in a straight line. We have to be like the birds. We have to be able to turn. We have to be able to adjust for wind gusts and all of that. So you want what they call active stability, active control, meaning that the pilot is going to be doing the same thing that somebody riding a bike would be doing. You'd be constantly making minute adjustments to adjust for the conditions in the air. That's what's going to be able to help you turn, to make circles, figure eights, and just to not crash. So their control system, they use wing warping, which means they're twisting the wings to provide more lift on one side than the other. That's what gets it to turn, whereas now we use a little bit different system. We use ailerons and stuff on the wings, but their control system, this wing warping, was what they patented, and that was really their key invention. But it wasn't the only invention. It was these other things too, realizing how airfoils and such work. And I'm spending a lot of time on the Wright brothers for a good reason. We'll connect the dots here in a minute. So they also did a lot of crashing. They weren't afraid to fail. That's something very important for you engineering types, and especially now we see in the government there's a lot of fear of failure. Well, failure is useful. You learn a lot more from an unsuccessful test than you do from a successful test, right? Well, the Wright brothers did that. They learned an awful lot from a lot of these crashes. Fortunately, they didn't kill themselves. Incidentally, that's one of the reasons they went to Kitty Hawk. They wanted a place with nice, soft, sandy beaches so that when they crashed, they wouldn't kill themselves. Pretty smart. 1903, we get back to that original picture. They make the first flight after putting all the pieces together. The other two pieces were the engine. They had their mechanic build a nice light engine. Pretty small, pretty underpowered, but it was enough to get them up in the air. And the second piece, or the third piece of the puzzle there, was the propeller. They were the first ones to realize and really apply the idea of airfoils or wing shapes to propellers. It wasn't like a ship. A propeller is really just a wing turned on its side and kind of twisted to provide the same sort of lift, but as thrust going in a straight line instead of up and down. So they used those same theories they were developing with their wind tunnel to apply to propellers, and then they were able to get efficient power out of that engine and apply it to the air and stay in the air. So 1903, December, they make that first flight. They come back home. They realize, hey, you know what? We need to do our flight testing somewhere closer to home. We can't spend 2 days getting out to North Carolina every time we want to make a flight test. So they looked around. They found Huffman Prairie. Most of you guys probably know where that is. In case you don't, that's the map here. This is Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, Area B. That's our big runway. This little patch of ground out here was Huffman Prairie. It was a cow pasture. The owner of it let the Wrights use it for free as long as they cut the grass and moved his cows out of the way. So starting in the spring of 1904, 1905, that's where they really turned the airplane from something that could stay up in the air for a few seconds to something that would stay up in the air as long as they wanted it to, or really until they ran out of gas. Huffman Prairie in 1904 and really in 1905 is where they really perfected, as much as they could, their airplane, where they could make circles, they could do figure eights, they could just fly around for an hour if they needed to, basically as long as they needed. That's where they realized, hey, we've got a product here that actually works, and now we can get to down to business, which is actually selling the airplane and making a lot of money. So this is from 1905. This is Huffman Prairie there. Their shed, there's a replica still of it out there. That's their flyer from that year. That's the oil derrick that they used as a catapult to speed them on the ground to help them take off in a much shorter distance. It's a bicycle shop. So that's where we are in 1904. It's the Wright brothers. They're doing their first bit of aviation on what's now Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. So if you want to talk about our connection of the base to aviation history, well, that's it. It's this 1904 is it. And we've got kind of that longer claim than anybody else in the country and in the world. So we're going to fast forward a little bit. Wright brothers, after 1905, realized they have a product. Now they want to sell it. So they actually stopped flying for a couple of years because they were going to focus on the business aspects of it. They saw as their primary customer first the U.S. government. Why? Because they were going to charge a lot of money. They wanted between $20,000 and $30,000, which in 1905 was a lot of money. And especially if they could sell a bunch of these, that's going to make them really rich. So first they approached the Army in 1905 and said, hey, we've got an airplane that we would love to sell you. The Army says, great, we would love to buy an airplane. It sounds like a great kind of technology. Great, so everybody's happy, right? Well, unfortunately not. The Wright brothers were very secretive. They didn't want to lose their monopoly on the airplane. So their deal was, if you pay us for the airplane, then we'll show you the airplane. So, money up front. The Army had gotten burned a few years earlier by a guy named Samuel Langley, who was head of the Smithsonian. Langley Air Force is named for him. They had paid him like $50,000 to build an airplane. He tried to launch his airplane off the Potomac River, made a great submarine, but a terrible airplane. It ended up in the river every attempted flight. So the Army's like, yeah, we're not going to do that. Show us the airplane, show us it works, and we'd be happy to write you a nice big check. Well, neither party would move, so it kind of sat there. The Army did not end up with an airplane. The Wrights end up going up to Europe. They do some demonstrations. They do some more demonstrations here in Dayton. And so they kind of convinced the Army that, hey, maybe there is something to this. So in 1907, they get back together and are like, all right, we hear you have an airplane that actually works. There's a lot of people saying it happens, so let's make this happen. Let's write a contract. December of 1907, the Army writes this contract for an airplane. Because, of course, we work for the government. Everything's got to be by the book, right? It's got to be on contract. So they literally sit down with the Wright brothers on a train and write the specifications for an airplane. Like, okay, well, how far can your airplane fly? We make that a requirement in the contract. How much weight can it carry? Okay, we're going to write that in the contract. So they basically wrote the request for proposals here, the specification, exactly to match the Wright brothers flying machine. Shockingly, dozens of people replied to this saying, yeah, pay us, we've got flying machines. But the reality was, once the Army said, hey, you got to put some money down with your contract, then we'll give you the rest of the money, everybody dropped out. Eventually, the Wright brothers, obviously, were the only people left. So they first provide an airplane. 1908, they take it to the Washington, D.C. area to go do some flight testing. Unfortunately, there's an accident. The propeller cracks, the airplane crashes, kills a guy named Thomas Selfridge, Army officer, injures Orville Wright, breaks his back and a few other things, and he suffers from that for the rest of his life, but that was the first kind of casualty. That set them back about a year, so it wasn't until late 1909 that the Army first accepted what we called Signal Corps Number 1, the very first airplane. You can go see it, very first military airplane in the world. You can go see a replica over at the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force. So, 1909, we've got one airplane, Signal Corps Number 1. At that point, the French particularly are driven by aviation, the Germans, the Brits, the Italians, everybody's building their own airplanes, and the technology just really takes off in the next few years. Of course, we had the Wright brothers, so we've got a head start on everybody, just like with AI or something now, right? We've got sort of this big head start, so obviously we lead the world in aviation technology, right? No, we don't. So I'm going to show you a couple slides here in a minute, but basically over the next 5 years, we don't really invest in aviation at all because that's not what the US government does. Back then, we were really small government. We didn't pay for anything essentially at all that we didn't have to. There was no Air Force Life Cycle Management Center back then. There was none of that kind of stuff. So, an airplane development was left up to private industry. Well, private industry didn't have a whole lot of customers for a $20,000, $25,000 airplane, which $25,000 was what the Wright brothers got for their first military airplane. So technology development here kind of stagnated. And there was also a patent conflict between Glenn Curtiss, another aviation pioneer in America, and the Wright brothers. So that by the time these guys show up, this is 1913, our aviation technology has really withered. I mean, these guys, 5 years after buying that first military airplane, are still flying essentially souped up Wright brothers airplanes, whereas the rest of the world has airplanes that look a lot more like the stuff you see in World War I. This is a group of pilots from a place called North Island, which is just off the coast in San Diego. If you want to talk about a first engineering organization for aviation, these were it. These were Army pilots. They were a training base, but they realized, hey, we've got these airplanes. We're not getting a whole lot of what you might think of as logistical support. There's no modernization. So they were kind of left on their own to experiment with that. But that early style airplane had a lot of flaws to it. These guys were flying those, and their attrition rate was terrible. So 1912, 13, and 14, they had 48 pilots there. Of those 48 pilots, 13 died. So think about that. I mean, that's a greater rate of attrition than we usually see in wartime. And that's just from training accidents. So the Army realized something's amiss here. We have to figure out a way out of this. That's why I say you get what you pay for. The Army's not paying for any aviation development. The US government isn't subsidizing that industry. So what we get is a lot of accidents. We get 25% of our pilots dying in accidents. And these were some of those poor guys. I have this guy circled. That's a guy named Virginius Clark. He's going to come up in the story in a few more slides. So the Army does something oddly smart. They hire an engineer, this guy, Grover Loaning. He had been the Wright brothers' chief engineer for the past few years. He was the first guy in the United States to get aeronautical engineering from Cornell, interestingly. The Army hires him. They say, hey, we have this big problem out at North Island. Go figure out what's going on and help fix it. So that's exactly what he does. Within a year, he has them get rid of all the Wright brothers style airplanes and buy new modern style airplanes, the kind with the engines in the front, the tail in the back, all the stuff that looked like an airplane that we know. And so within that year, the fatality rate drops to 0. So they did the smart thing by hiring an engineer. Loaning only stays working for the government for about a year. Once he kind of mission accomplished, he moved back to industry, started his own company, and he pops in and out of the story from years on, but he tries to make a lot of money doing engineering stuff with private industry. But it was that hiring of an engineer that's really what sets the stage for what we do at Wright-Patt these days. And Grover Loaning is kind of the grandfather, if you were, of Air Force engineering since he was our first. And this guy here, Virginius Clark, he was also an engineer, but he had gotten his degree from the Naval Academy. He was actually a Navy guy that switched over to the Army to do flying, and because really the Navy didn't really want him, he wasn't a very good sailor. And at the Naval Academy, his most remarkable record was the number of demerits he got there, not his academic record. So, okay. So over the next few years, Grover Loaning has fixed that. So what happens? We've learned our lesson, right? Now we're going to invest more in aviation. We're going to catch up with everybody else. So I love this. This is a favorite quote of mine. It's probably apocryphal. According to stories at the time, there was a senator when the Army approached them saying, hey, we need more money because we need to buy more airplanes. We've got, I don't know, about 6 of them, so we obviously need more airplanes. The senator supposedly replied, why all this fuss about airplanes? I thought we already had one. One airplane does not make an Air Force, as we know. But that was the mentality of Congress at the time. The administration was not going to spend any money that didn't have to. So where does the U.S. fall? So this is the kind of airplane we're talking about in 1913 that Grover Loaning had us start flying after that. So more modern. Looking at other countries, France led the world in aviation investment. About $7.5 million just in 1 year in terms of government appropriations for aviation. So where's the United States? Are we second? Nope. Germany. Russia's third. We're kind of tied for second. Are we fourth? Nope, that's England. Fifth? Nope, that's Italy. Are we sixth? Nope, that's Mexico. We're seventh. France, $7.5 million. United States, about $100,000. What happens in 1914? World War I starts. The fall of 1914, World War I starts in Europe. The United States is going to stay out of it. Not our problem. We're going to let those guys, murder each other in trenches and do all of that kind of stuff. And that's really where you see the combat debut of airplanes. That's why I like these pictures. You can see how, hey, suddenly we've got warplanes fighting each other. You got fighters, you got bombers, you got all of that stuff. You got recon planes. So in those 2.5 years of World War I, all these European companies, they invent basically the same categories of airplanes that we still use today. Like I said, we've got fighter planes, we've got bomber planes, they've got attack planes. We don't really have cargo planes. We're not hauling a lot of cargo in airplanes at this point. You get the reconnaissance airplanes. They're using Zeppelins and all that kind of stuff too. But it was really the specialization of airplanes that becomes important. And then, like they say, we call this the crucible of war, where it really speeds up technology development during the war. And we see that like in Ukraine and stuff like that now, where the pace of technology really accelerates as the offense tries to get the advantage and the defense compensates and the offense compensates again and just goes back and forth. So their aviation technology skyrockets while the United States is not involved. And I just love this picture because here you got cavalry with swords and an airplane flying over their head. And in fact, a lot of our early aviation officers came from the cavalry because there's a story I'll tell later, but yeah, it was essentially exactly this picture, and that's what I'm going to talk about. So now we get to our story. I've only been talking for about 20 minutes, and now first time I mentioned McCook Field. That's because we came out of World War I. If you don't understand what was happening in aviation development and in World War I, you can't understand why McCook Field showed up. What was it doing there? Why did we need it? Well, this is kind of step one of that. For a variety of reasons, you can say unrestricted submarine warfare, sinking Lusitania, all of that kind of stuff. But basically, we declare war on, on Germany, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and we get involved in the war. But we're very determined not to participate in the same way that the Europeans did. If you've seen any movie about World War I, read a single book about it, the defining characteristic of that war was trench warfare, right? Thousands of people dying every day, millions of casualties on both sides as, you got a bunch of infantry guys in one trench facing a bunch of infantry guys in another trench. But those guys on the other side have machine guns. And so we think, hey, both sides really, before the U.S. is involved, think, hey, what's a great idea? We got to go take that trench. So we're just going to have everybody jump out of the trench, go rush at those machine guns, and hope everybody doesn't die. Well, for the most part, everybody did die, so that's why they ended up with millions of casualties during World War I. The United States is like, yeah, we're not going to do that. So what we're going to do is we're going to put U.S. mass production to work. We are going to mechanize our way through the war and use our industry that is the best in the world. Who invented the assembly line? Henry Ford, right? And that's kind of a loose term, but basically, we're cranking out thousands of Model Ts and all of this stuff, cash registers here in Dayton, everything on assembly line. So we're going to convert that industry to war making, and that's what we're going to do. We're not going to send American doughboys to die by the millions in the trenches. No, we're going to throw millions of dollars worth of equipment at the bad guys and let that stuff take the brunt of it, and that's how we're going to win the war. So these are just the local papers from when we declared war. As you can see, April 6, 1917, we get involved. As was mentioned in the introduction here, what does this have to do with aviation? Well, just literally within weeks of our declaring war, We talk to our allies and say, how can we help? Well, mass production's a good way to do it. One thing you can do is provide a lot of airplanes. Airplanes are now a crucial part of war, so help us provide airplanes. Great. We are going to, quote unquote, darken the skies of Europe with American airplanes. Perfect. Congress says, all right, we're going to make up for lost time. We are going to allocate $640 million to aviation. Single largest appropriation to anything in US history to that point in time. I did the math at one point. It's something like $17 billion or $170 billion. It's a lot of money in any case, more than we've spent on anything. And that's just to do that darkening of the skies of Europe by building American airplanes, getting them overseas and equipping them, all of that stuff. So it's an insane amount of money. So they throw that at the Army and say, okay, here's essentially your blank check. Give us an Air Force. Okay. Well, as you might expect, that stuff doesn't really happen overnight. You can't just go from building, we're literally hand building single airplanes, like we're buying maybe a dozen, maybe 20 airplanes per year in the United States. That's from all sources. There is no aircraft industry. It's basically people building them in glorified garages. You've seen the Wright brothers plant, some of you probably, in Dayton there. They're building handfuls of these. There's no rush. The Army starts looking around. They are the people responsible for airplanes, the Signal Corps. Why the Signal Corps? Well, that's who bought it from the Wright brothers. Well, why the Signal Corps? Well, they were doing balloons. Okay, well, why do balloons go to the Signal Corps? Because they're the same kind of thing that cavalry would do. They were doing scouting, they were relaying messages, they were transporting stuff. So that just made sense, especially when you just had a few of them. It's doing the same kind of function that we would do with like a radio or something like that. Great. So the Signal Corps is looking around, well, wait a minute. We've got a lot of money to buy airplanes. We have, to date, the US military had purchased somewhere south of about 180 airplanes since the Wright brothers, and that's it. Of those, fewer than 100 were actually operational. And of those fewer than 100, 0 of them were warfighting airplanes. They were all training airplanes, they were all scout airplanes, which were basically the same thing. We did not have a single airplane with a gun on it. We didn't have a single airplane with a bomb on it. So how useful is that going to be during wartime? Not very useful. So we realized, hey, you know what? Maybe we need some way to figure out what we're going to do with all this money to build, buy, design, whatever we need to do to get an actual Air Force. So they're going to create a new organization, the Airplane Engineering Division. This gets formed out in Washington, D.C. Signal Corps says, okay, we're going to have this new organization. You guys are going to spend the $640 million, give us, thousands, tens of thousands of airplanes, all of that good stuff. Okay, great. We need some people to do it. We go back to our good friend Virginius Clark, who was one of those North Island guys, the guy who kind of got kicked out of the Navy, who got all those demerits and that kind of stuff. But he was a really good engineer. Nobody argues that. He just didn't have what you might call military bearing. He wasn't so concerned about the pleats on his pants and having appropriate insignia on his uniform, that kind of stuff. But he was a good engineer. But he was the only one we had at the time. So guess what? Virginius Clark, you're going to be head of plane design. Okay, great. Well, there's more to an airplane than just aerodynamics, just designing a plane. How do you make an airplane go? Engine design. It needs an engine on the front to make it go. So we do something that we saw a lot during World War I. We brought guys from private industry into essentially reserve officer roles. These were like the titans of industry, guys who made millions of dollars in places like General Motors or Chrysler, or in this guy's case, Packard. Jesse Vincent was the chief engineer for Packard Motor Cars. He had dabbled around with making really large engines. He put the first V12 engine in an American car. There's a nice Packard museum over here in Dayton. Anybody been there? They've got the Jesse Vincent Special. That's him. He designed that car after the war. He was their chief engineer before the war and the chief engineer until the 1940s. So he did a lot of stuff with Packard. Well, he was an engine expert, so the Army first brought him in on a consulting basis. He and another guy sat in a hotel room. We had told them that, hey, you know what? We need an engine to power all these thousands of airplanes. What we've seen from Europe for our allies, every single airplane type they had a different engine. That meant each country had like 30-some different types of engines. Can you imagine trying to sustain that in the field? Every fighter, every bomber, whatever, they've all got different engines made by different companies. So the logistics train of trying to support that was terrible. You'd have to have mechanics who knew how to fix all these engines. They had all the spare parts. So we're like, we're not going to do that. Instead, what we're going to do, using American ingenuity, we're going to design one standard engine and we're going to put it in every single airplane. Well, that seems a little weird because, you've got big airplanes, small airplanes, so you can't use one engine. So what we're going to do, we're going to design one engine and we're just going to add or subtract more cylinders to get more or less horsepower. You can go see several versions of the result of this. They call it the Liberty engine. over in the Air Force Museum. They're parked there in the front. So there's a 4-cylinder, a 6-cylinder, 8-cylinder, 12-cylinder, 16-cylinder. After the war, we did 24 and 36-cylinder versions of it. We just kept sticking them together. And so that was a great idea. But the problem is the engine wasn't optimized for any particular platform. They were just generic. And its base, the most common model was a 400 horsepower. But Jesse Vincent was the co-designer of that. And the story goes, he and this other guy designed it in a hotel room in Washington, D.C. in a weekend. Which is kind of true, but they just basically took the best features of other engines, stuck them together and said, here's the plans. Okay, so later that summer in 1917, he decides to go ahead and join. He gets made head of the engine design. So he and Virginia Clark are the airplane engineering department. They have to figure out how to spend the $640 million. We got 2 guys. They have a boss, but he actually dies in a car accident. So we had 3 guys, now we have 2 guys. Well, this isn't gonna work. We've got to figure out, again, airplanes to build. How do we build these? What technologies do we need? What do they look like? This is their boss, Major General George Squire. He's the head of the Signal Corps. So he's kind of the guy that's responsible for all that airplane stuff. He says the bottleneck of the aircraft program is the technology bit. It's what these guys are going to do. We need to have a technology organization to figure out all of this airplane stuff. They tried to move out of Washington to Langley Field. That was where McCook Field was going to be located in the first place, this airplane engineering division. They were going to put it at Langley. The predecessor for NASA had just started building a facility there, the NACA, National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics. So, hey, we're just going to piggyback on them. Well, we tried it, but we quickly realized that, man, this is going to take a long time to build out there. They were building these pretty fancy brick buildings and wind tunnels and stuff like that. And, after a few months, essentially nothing had happened. We also realized, my apologies if anybody's been out to Langley or is from there, but it was kind of in the middle of nowhere. How are we going to get thousands of qualified technical people to go work there? We weren't. So they quickly realized that, hey, this guy says, trying to build, here's the bottleneck of the aircraft program, let's pivot. We need to come up with Plan B. Plan B, he turns to the head of the equipment division. That's the guy he's made in charge of the airplane program because he's really a radio engineer. He's worried about the traditional Signal Corps stuff, not airplanes. Who does he hire? Colonel Edward Deeds. Does his name sound familiar to anybody? He was an engineer. He had worked for NCR. By 1917, he was a classic industrialist. He had several companies. He owned a lot of property around Dayton. He was a very wealthy man. He went into the reserves. And he became Colonel Deeds, which he called himself Colonel Deeds until the end of his life. But he got put in charge of the equipment division because, he had a lot of experience with industry, with mass production, with all this kind of mechanical stuff. So Squire goes to Deeds and says, hey, this Langley thing isn't working out. We need to look someplace else. Where's Deeds from? Dayton. Huh. Deeds tells bosses, maybe you should consider Dayton. Look where we are. Here's Dayton. This is an actual map that I pulled from the documents at the time. Here's Dayton. We are right in the center of all of this industry. Now we think of the Rust Belt and all that stuff had shut down, but this is steel industry, out here. You've got the automobile industry, including Indiana, was big in automobiles at the time, Indianapolis. So, hey, Dayton's really close to all this stuff. And in Dayton, we've got a huge technical community of our own. There's a statistic I like to throw out there that I still can't find the source for, but I've seen it printed multiple times. At the turn of the 20th century, Dayton supposedly had more patents per capita than any other city in the United States. I haven't been able to verify that, but I've seen it repeated. So we have a big technical community. We have machine shops, we've got factories, we've got all this stuff that can support an airplane program. So if we need to build an airplane engineering division with a lot of technically oriented people, that's the place to do it. And oh, by the way, they need to know about airplanes. Where was the airplane invented? Dayton. We've got the Wright brothers still there. Well, one Wright brother. Poor Wilbur had died back in 1912. Orville's still around. They still have their company there. So, hey, we are aviation crazy. And of course, the Wright brothers, guys like Edward Deeds, Charles Kettering, those guys were good buddies with the Wright brothers. They loved airplanes too. And in fact, Deeds, Kettering, and then a couple of other friends had tried to start an airplane training company at a little site in North Dayton. This little site right here. That was basically a little spit of land. It had a park on it. There was a little baseball field there. Funny how things come around. They had this little training facility there. It didn't really work out. But then once World War I broke out, they realized, hey, there's money to be had here. We've got a lot of money to buy airplanes. So Deeds and Kettering and some of these other guys started a new company called the Dayton Wright Aircraft Company. Or airplane company. they're going to build or bid for government contracts to build airplanes. So great, they build a factory south of town. That was the longtime GM plant in Moraine. That was originally an airplane factory. So they're going to do that. But Deeds also had his land, his companies, and things like that around Dayton. So when he's telling the Army, hey, go check out Dayton, check out these facilities, he pointed them to a couple of different areas. One was south of town, which was right next to the new factory that they had just established there. The other was what they called Northfield, this area here. It was fallow. It was basically a floodplain. So like during the Dayton flood, all of this was underwater. The flood back in 1913, it was all underwater, but hey, the land's cheap. And by the way, Deeds kind of owns part of it, but he really divested it. He basically sold his shares to Kettering and those other guys. And so he wasn't really technically involved, but he sends the Army to go check it out. We've got correspondence. The Army looks at it and they're like, yeah, we'd really like to have that place south of town, but because we're in a hurry, this place that's north of town, we're gonna go ahead and take that. That's fine. Lease rates are relatively cheap. October 1st, they sign a lease. For basically, it's a year-to-year lease. They anticipate it's going to last the duration of the war, and they'll just sign it, renew the lease every year. Great, so they're going to build that. Starts construction or lease signed October 1st. They open up in mid-December of 1917. So not even 2.5 months later, they're open for business. I'm going to show you a couple of maps here just so you get a better idea where it is. This is downtown Dayton as it is now. The split in the river. This is what they call Old North Dayton. And then that's the McCook Field area. So that's what it looked like then. These stars were where we had leased a couple of buildings for the offices at the time. So more recent pictures. So I pulled this from Google Maps yesterday. That's what it looks like today. It's the Kettering ball fields. That's McCook Field. That's that same area. And this is a close-up of that. So it's industry, the ball fields, that kind of stuff. Keep this picture in mind just to help kind of visualize. I'm going to flip that on its side. So here's the baseball fields. And then here's where we set up McCook Field. This is Kiwi Street right here. These are all the McCook Field buildings that we set up there. So just to give you an idea of where we're talking about geography. This is what McCook Field like once it was open and running. Hangars, test facilities, all this kind of stuff. There's that picture going back to the beginning. There's the gate that's actually right here. The War Department. Hey, Back to the Future. Anybody heard the recent news? We're back to being the War Department instead of the Department of Defense. Bureau of Aircraft Production. Those are the ones that are overseeing aircraft production. Airplane Engineering Department, we've changed names. We keep changing names, it gets really confusing. I just call it the Engineering Division because that's what we were for most of the time period. McCook Field, Dayton, Ohio. They name it McCook Field because the land had been partly owned by the fighting McCooks of Civil War fame. They sent something like a dozen boys off to fight the Civil War, and there were, I don't know, like 4 or 5 generals involved in there, Anson McCook and some others. So instead of naming it from an aviator, they named it from the McCook family. Nothing to do with aviation. But this is McCook Field, so you get a good sort of generalization. All right, so what did McCook do? We have several phases of our lifespan. One is during the war. We do production engineering. Well, that's solving the problems with actually building airplanes and engines. Once we decide what airplanes we're going to build, what engines, we've got the Liberty engine, up and running. Well, once we start testing those and getting on those airplanes, we find a lot of problems. There's a lot of problems in production. So Jesse Vincent and Virginia Clark are overseeing those. They're helping solve the problems. They literally bring in hundreds of engineers, thousands of mechanics and all this kind of stuff to McCook Field to do all of this work, to figure out, hey, what are the problems? How can we fix it? Test solutions, all of that. Get those back into production so that way we can send viable war material to our war fighters over in France. Airplanes are being built mostly at that Dayton Wright plant in Moraine that I mentioned. That's where this is. Those are their DH-4 airplanes that they're building. Our standard one, they built a few thousand of those, sent somewhere north of 1,000 of them over to France by the end of the war. We're doing prototype evaluation. Well, if we're gonna buy thousands of airplanes, what airplane types are we gonna buy? Well, we had airplane companies coming out of the woodwork trying to sell us airplanes because there was a lot of money to be had. So some of them were ones that had actual viable airplanes. Others were fly-by-night, pun intended, that did not have very good airplanes. This picture is actually from after the war, but it's a really good representation. This is from the McCook newspaper. This guy, Thurman Bain, he was head of McCook Field. But this is showing all the airplane companies trying to sell their airplane designs to him because he controlled those purse strings. If we're going to let a new contract to buy a fighter, it was McCook Field that was deciding which one should we buy. Do they meet the specs? Is this one better than that one? Should we buy the Boeing airplane or the Martin airplane or whatever it is? These were the guys that were deciding. So this guy really had a lot of control over the future of American aircraft industry. That gives you an idea. We're doing this prototype evaluation in McCook Field. Here's a couple of examples. We're testing American airplanes. This is the Vought VE-7. They liked it a lot, pretty solid airplane. The Navy liked these. The Navy ended up buying a fair number of them. We only had a handful. This is a Caproni bomber. One of the things that we don't think about now, we saw a lot of airplanes overseas to our allies. Back in World War I, it was exactly the opposite. We were buying airplanes from a lot of other countries because they had war-proven designs and we didn't. So in terms of large bombers, we bought a Handley Page bomber from the Brits, and this Caproni bomber we wanted to buy from the Italians. Well, the Italians got pretty difficult. They wanted too much money to license their design to build in the United States. They kept flying them around in the US, like kind of demonstrations to drum up support. They kept crashing, so we never really bought any of these and built any in the US for the war, before the war ended. But just a couple of examples there. There were dozens more. I mentioned, these were by established airplane companies, more or less. Less established one was this one by the Lanzius Aircraft Company. This was a company that had been doing other things, decided to jump on the airplane bandwagon. It designed this cool airplane that kind of went back to the Wright brothers' wing warping, but in a much more serious or more intense kind of way. This changed angle of incidence, meaning the whole wing could bend. They brought it there and said, hey, we want you guys to test fly this. Our engineers looked at it, our test pilots looked at it, and there's no way in hell we're going to fly this airplane. So Lanzius complains to his congressman and says, hey, why won't your Army test my airplane? It's this brilliant design with this great innovative feature. Congress calls up George Squire and says, hey, I need you to test our airplane. Our guys say, no, we're not going to test it, but you know what? If you can prove on our field that your airplane flies, have at it. So they hire some poor schmuck to go be their test pilot to go fly this. The Army's like, hey, hands off, we're having nothing to do with this. The higher headquarters is like, fine, we understand. So they put a pilot in there. He needs money to feed his wife and kid, literally, to go fly this thing. Takes off, doesn't get a mile before it crashes, and the pilot is killed, widowing and orphaning his wife and baby. So shows that we knew what we were talking about. We had the technical expertise now to make these judgments. Our bread and butter, testing. We did a lot of testing to make sure stuff would live up to its specifications. For engines was a great example. So these are on dynamometers. These are testing these Liberty engines, make sure they're putting out the right amount of horsepower. This is an engine test stand. Every engine had to be able to run for 50 hours without breaking. The infamous 50-hour test. So every time you put a new component in it, you would have to rerun it for 50 hours. This one, as you might be able to tell, did not last 50 hours. So back to the drawing board on that one. We did a lot of engine testing. We also did structural testing. We've got to make sure engines are going to run. We've got to make sure that the airplanes meet what we call the factor of safety. Can they sustain the loads they're going to experience in flight or not? Well, we don't want to put a poor guy up there to pilot it to see if the wings are going to fall off. We want to test it on the ground. So they would put it up on these stands, load them with sandbags. This airplane's actually upside down because you got to put the weight, So these carefully weighted sandbags, so you would put the expected loads in flight up to the factor of safety. Like if you're imagining it's going to, see a certain amount, 1,000 pounds, whatever it might be, of pressure, we're going to do it up to 2,000 just to make sure it's, extra safe for us, right? So they would test every airplane. They would test the wings, the landing gear, the fuselages to make sure they could live up to what we needed them to for flight so our guys could fly safely. This was an idea we actually borrowed from the Europeans. We were only in the war for about a year before it ended, year and a half really, but McCook Field was only open for about a year before the war ended. So we didn't have a lot of chance to do what we called technology transition, meaning develop something and then get it out in the field. This thing is called a machine gun synchronizer. So here I got the circle. The machine guns are on top of the engine here. The propeller's in front of them. What happens if the propeller's spinning and you start firing your machine gun? You might shoot off your own propeller. Not such a brilliant design. But if you tried to do things like put the machine gun up here or out on the wings, it was really hard for pilots to aim. But also the machine gun's jammed a lot. So you couldn't go unjam a machine gun if it's out on your wing. It needed to be right in front of you. They needed to figure out a way to fire it through the propeller. Well, the Germans came up with a top secret system that involved a synchronizer gear. So basically it would just compute, it would just interrupt the machine gun from firing every time the propeller was hypothetically in front of the guns. That method actually worked pretty well. It was Anthony Fokker that came up with that. Top secret though, we didn't have access to that technology because the Germans were the bad guys. The Brits came up with a system doing the same sort of thing using a pneumatic pressurized oil cylinders and stuff. It was really hugely complicated. We copied their design, but it turns out it didn't really work well with our Liberty engine, so we needed to come with our own design. So we put our guys to work. A guy named Adolf Nelson, designed this. It's the Nelson machine gun synchronizer. We had a lot of good electrical engineers. Remember Edward Deeds? He was an electrical engineer. We had these cash register guys that did electric cash registers. So we did this electrical system that had this cable that would send pulses to the machine gun to tell it to not shoot. The French came up with a pretty ingenious design. What they decided to do, just put metal plates on the back of the propeller and hope for the best. So, anybody know who this guy is? All right, pop quiz. Where do I work? What's the Air Force base? Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. We know who the Wright brothers are. Who's Patterson? That's this guy. This is that Patterson. If you know the Patterson name, it's probably from NCR. The Patterson brothers, namely John Patterson, founded NCR. Well, this was the son of the other brother, not John Patterson. This is Frank Stewart Patterson. He was his son. So 3 of the Patterson sort of younger generation ended up going into World War I in various capacities. He became a pilot. He actually dropped out, I think it was Princeton, dropped out of Princeton to become a pilot. They assigned him back here to Dayton. He was actually at Wilbur Wright Field, which is what's Wright-Patterson Air Force Base now. That opened up as a training base and also did a little bit of experimentation in the summer of 1917. He was one of our earliest test pilots, Frank Stewart Patterson. So they had him doing a flight test on this machine gun synchronizer over what's now Wright-Pat. So he takes his airplane up to test out the brand new American-built, designed machine gun synchronizer, fires the gun. He's at about 10,000 feet, if I recall correctly, fires the machine gun. You can guess what happens next. It actually works perfectly. Brilliant design. He says, awesome. Completes the test. He goes to dive to land. His wing collapses. Then he falls to his death. He and the guy sitting in the back seat both perished. They're not wearing parachutes because nobody was wearing parachutes at that time. Frank Stewart Patterson dies there. He's one of the earliest test pilots to die at Wright-Pat. Later on, back in the 1930s, we end up naming the other half of the base for Patterson. It used to be Wright Field and Patterson Field, now Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. So he tested this, but our system worked great. That was actually his plane wreck. You can see how disastrous that was. All right, the interwar years. So the war ends in November 1918. Fortunately, but unfortunately, fortunately for our boys fighting the war ends. Unfortunately for all this cool technology development we're doing, we don't get any of that out in the field. We don't get to test it. We've actually got some brand new American airplane designs that are arguably would be some of the best ones in the war if the war had gone on about another 6 months. But because the war ended, we never got any American designed and built airplanes in the field or any of the other kind of cool technology we were working on. So really most of what McCook Field did was what we call the interwar period, the years between the end of World War I and the start of World War II. So about 20 years, 1918 to 1938, 1939, when the war began in Europe again. So what were we doing there? Well, mostly we were doing technology development. We weren't really so worried about production engineering because production had fallen off a cliff. So we were doing the kind of technology stuff that the Air Force Research Lab does today. This was our head of it, Thurman Bain. He was the guy in that comic that I showed. He was the head of McCook Field from 1918, the end of the war basically, until 1922. Sadly for him, he had to retire due to he had a brain tumor, so he retired early and ended up dying in 1932. But he was really crucial. He was the guy that realized, hey, if we want to stay open, if we want to make a valuable contribution to what's now the Army Air Service, it's split off from the Signal Corps, we have to have a unique mission. We have to do this science and technology thing, this research and development that nobody else is doing. So he pivots us immediately from this wartime footing to this research footing. He's the guy that establishes it more like a academic sort of environment where we've got specific disciplines. We've got our structures guys, we've got our aero guys, we've got our engine guys, and then they set it up to basically improve airplane technology as a whole across all of industry. So if there's a guy to really thank for shaping how we approach all this stuff, that's why I like this picture. Shows you all the different components of an airplane, all the stuff inside there. He realizes, hey, it's going to be our job to make all that stuff better. So what are some examples of what we do? Well, we're doing aerodynamics. We imported this guy actually during the war. He was a Russian. He'd been head of the aero department at MIT. So he was a really brilliant guy. He came to work in McCook Field, first as a private, then as a sergeant, and then finally he got promoted to an officer. But he was one of the smartest aerodynamicists in the world during the war. So he set up the aerodynamics department at McCook Field. First they built this 14-inch wind tunnel, modeled after the Wright brothers, and then later on a 5-foot wind tunnel. This 14-inch one, by the way, it's still over at the Air Force Museum. You can go check it out. It's really a work of art. Parachutes. Remember how I mentioned Frank Stewart Patterson didn't have a parachute? Well, really nobody had parachutes. The balloon guys had parachutes, but The airplane guys mostly didn't. The Germans were the first to start using parachutes. But what was the problem with those? Well, most parachutes worked kind of like what you see with paratroopers. They used something called a static line. Your parachute was attached to a bag attached to your airplane. So you'd be sitting on it or it was on the outside of the airplane. And then you'd have a separate rope connecting a harness to the parachute that's inside the bag and it's connected to you. So when you would jump, it would pull the rope, pull the whole pack out, and then once it got taut, your parachute would rip out of the bag and would open and deploy. That's how the balloon guides worked, and that's how most of the other airplane ones worked that were available. Well, that worked great for balloons because when a balloon was going down, you were pretty much going in a straight line. But if you're an airplane that got shot down, what's happening to you? Well, you're spinning, you're falling, whatever. So what would happen is these things would get twisted around the airplane, and the poor guy stuck with his parachute on the outside of a crashing airplane. Other pilots would see this and be horrified. They're like, I'd rather go down in flames with my airplane than hanging out the back of it, right? And this here was actually taken from an accident. This was a British-designed parachute that was exactly of that type. We didn't want to test it. The British company that was selling them insisted that they do it. They're like with that Lanzius airplane, hey, you want to do it? Be our guest. So the guy jumped from that. This thing got tangled in the wires on the side of the airplane, and it basically ripped the cables from his parachute, and the guy basically free fell without a parachute in front of hundreds of people watching to his death at McCook Field. So we need a better idea. That's where these guys come in. They put together a bunch of ideas to really come up with the first standardized free-fall ripcord operated parachute. That's the key here. Basically a parachute like you would do if you go skydiving now. You jump out of an airplane, your parachute's in a bag attached to your chest or your back, and you go fly away from the airplane, and then you pull a ripcord and it opens up. Well, we didn't invent that exactly, but some of the guys that did invent that technology, like Floyd Smith here, those guys came to work for us. And so we put those pieces together, we standardized parachutes, and because we did that, we were able to, here's a good example, we were able to get those out to our service guys. But there was still a lot of hesitation to use it, but they ended up saving a lot of lives. Don't read what it says there, it's a little bit of a spoiler, but it's also wrong. Harold Harris, he was one of our test pilots, a really kind of funny guy. He lived to be 90-something. He was still around Dayton until the 1990s. I mean, he lived a long life despite having been a test pilot and done some crazy, crazy stuff. He was test flying this over McCook Field one day. Remember where McCook Field is? It's surrounded by neighborhoods on one side, downtown Dayton on other. He was doing a dogfight in this mock dogfight in this airplane. Suddenly, the wing starts to collapse. Fortunately, he's wearing a parachute because one of his coworkers had died about 6 months earlier. He was Thurman Bain's aide. The same thing had happened, but he wasn't wearing his parachute because it was optional for them. Thurman Bain was crushed because and no pun intended, crushed because his aide, who was a good friend of his, had died in that accident. So he mandated that any pilot flying in or out of McCook had to wear a parachute. Because of that, about 6 months earlier, Harold Harris was wearing a parachute when he had to jump out of the airplane. So when it says he was the first man saved by a parachute, he was the first to be saved in an actual emergency by this free-fall ripcord-operated parachute. What happened to him? Well, the wing fell off. His airplane ended up in a backyard in Dayton. Fortunately, nobody was killed, but that's the actual picture of it. Where did he end up? He ended up in somebody else's backyard. He literally crashed through a grape arbor. But he was alive. He got some scratches. So saved by a parachute. Everybody else from then on was like, yeah, we're wearing our parachutes. And eventually, it became mandatory across the air service within about another year or two. Turbochargers, a lot of people have those in your cars. Basically an air compressor to squish more air into your engine to get more power, right? Well, for airplanes, it wasn't for more power, it was to get more altitude. Because the air gets thinner when you go higher, so if you want to keep power in your engine, you need to cram more of that air into it. So turbochargers were a way to do that. And there's one on an engine. So we did the first airplane turbo technology development in the US. The design by this interesting looking fellow right here, Sanford Moss, the guy in the fuzzy hat. He worked for General Electric. Well, GE Aerospace, now one of the biggest companies around, they make all the American jet engines. They got their start because of Sanford Moss, because of his turbo work. We needed to altitude test it, so we put this engine on this little portable dynamometer, put it on a train, took it up to the top of Pikes Peak. That way we could actually test it at whatever it is, 18,000 feet, because we don't have test facilities like that in Dayton. So this is those guys up there freezing their butts off on top of a mountain. Turns out it works pretty well. But we realized that, hey, turbochargers aren't quite enough. We also need to work on propellers to make these airplanes fly in higher altitudes. Propellers testing was another one of our bread and butter things, like engines. So we did a lot of propeller design testing including what they call variable pitch, meaning that you could change the angle of the propeller, so that way it's kind of like changing gears in your car. If anybody remembers manual transmissions, right? Or on your bike, same thing could be done with a propeller. So we did that testing. This is kind of fun. Here we're doing spray testing. What happens to a wooden propeller when it's flying at a few hundred miles an hour and it gets hit by rain? It gets pretty pitted up. So we're testing that here on the ground. This is Dayton. What happens when you do it in the wintertime? You get a lot of ice. So I just think that's a cool picture. I like to throw that in there. So put all the pieces together, turbochargers, you get the better propellers for high altitude, you get test pilots, our buddy Shorty Schroeder here, one of our most famous test pilots from the early 1920s. So here's Shorty with his high altitude gear on, basically a mask, sucking oxygen through a straw. He's gonna go fly. He actually takes this airplane with his turbocharged engine. You can see a little turbocharger up there. He takes it up to 36,000 feet. That's like higher than like your Airbus or your Boeing flies these days. I mean, and it's in an open cockpit biplane. So that's the kind of capability that, we were able to provide through the turbochargers and these propellers and a lot of clothing. This is a funny story because when he got up to altitude, his goggles frosted over and his oxygen froze up. So he's trying to fix these. He pulls off his goggles. He's trying to unclog the ice out of his oxygen. Both of those things freeze up. He ends up passing out at altitude. His eyeballs freeze. He passes out. He wakes up plummeting towards the ground about 10,000 feet above the ground. He realizes that, I'm in kind of bad shape here because his airplane's about to crash. He also realizes his eyeballs are frozen, so he can't really see very well. But he stunningly, in one of our most amazing feats of airmanship, he's able to get the airplane back on the ground safely. Not only back on the ground, he actually gets back to McCook Field. He had flown from McCook Field and he was way out east of town, flying. He actually gets it back, lands at McCook, lands safely. The other guys run up. He's like, why isn't he getting out of his airplane? He's slumped over because he's like, basically catatonic. The doctor said his heart had swelled to like 4 times its normal size because of the rapid change in altitude and air pressure around him. So he ended up actually not flying for us again because of the damage he took, and he went into private industry after that. So a couple other technologies. Aerial photography. We didn't invent aerial cameras, but we made them a heck of a lot better. 2 pioneers, this guy, George Goddard, he was the night photographer. How do you take pictures at night from an airplane? Interesting, right? So he was the guy to figure out how to do that. Basically, you use a really big flash. He would drop a giant magnesium bomb from the back of the airplane and time it so that when the bomb exploded, the shutter on the camera would automatically go off and he could take pictures. So there's some pretty cool ones as you can see of that. But it would scare the crap out of whatever city he was taking a picture of. There's some pictures of Dayton like that, but Rochester, New York, where Kodak was the first place he did that. Some interesting stories about that too. This other guy here, Albert Stevens, he was the high altitude guy. He wanted to figure out how to take, these kind of pictures you see here. This is actually taken from about 20,000 feet. How do you take area pictures? This is McCook Field right here. Okay, instruments, we figured out how to fly long distances cross country. Everybody's heard of Charles Lindbergh, right? Well, the instruments he used to get from here to Paris were ones that we had developed at McCook Field. Metal aircraft, we experimented with those. We made some really, really ugly, heavy metal airplanes. We weren't really the pioneers there, and you can probably see why. Test pilots, we had a lot of test pilots. The name Jimmy Doolittle may sound familiar. He was at McCook Field for a few years in different points in time. He was the first guy in the United States to get a PhD in aeronautical engineering. So he was not just like the Doolittle Raider guy of World War II fame, but he was a brilliant engineer, my opinion, the greatest airman who ever lived. But this was from his master's thesis for MIT. He basically figured out, remember how we did all that, showed you all that structural testing stuff? He was the guy that figured out, well, how much factor of safety do we really need to put in airplanes? Let's go do G testing. So basically he's flying these airplanes, 7.2 Gs, 6.4 Gs to see until the wings would fall off. So he was really putting his life in his own hands. But he lived a long, healthy, he lived to like 96 too. We designed our own airplanes in-house. We had these guys doing their own airplane design shop. That got us in a little bit of trouble later because we were competing our own airplanes against private industry's airplanes for which ones to buy and put into production. Industry didn't like that very much, so we had to quit that in 1926. So by the mid-1920s, we had McCook Field was way too small for the size of airplanes. We had literally painted this sign right there. This field is small, use it all, so people would stop crashing through the fences at the end of the field. But they also realized that, hey, McCook Field's gonna have to move somewhere. So if you're familiar with the term base realignment and closure, that, in effect, happened in 1922 to McCook Field. They're like, hey, we're going to shut down. We've got to move somewhere. The only reason they were still open is because they were the only people doing their mission, and Congress was too cheap to pay the money to move it somewhere else. So they just sat there until, hey, this isn't safe. We got guys crashing into backyards and stuff. So here's some headlines. They're like, hey, yeah, McCook Field's going to move, blah, blah, blah. So people at Dayton step up. Our guys here, Frederick Patterson, really led the charge. He was head of NCR at this point. Basically, they decide that they're going to go do a giant fundraising campaign. Within a couple of days, they raised about $400,000 to buy all of this land over here. That's Wright Patterson Air Force Base. They bought the land from the private landowners that were there, the flood district that owned that, and said, hey, we're going to give this to the government for $1 if you move McCook Field there, if you move the engineering division to this spot and not somewhere else. The government's, yeah, sure, it's a lot cheaper to move it across town than it is to move it out to the East Coast. Great, so 1922, they do that fundraising. 1924, they agree to it. And then 1926, they start shutting down McCook Field. So this is use it field, use it all. So all that great stuff, this is the entire population of McCook Field in 1925. That's everybody who worked there. They had over 3,000 people during World War I, and now they're less than 1,000. So they literally, in order to save money, again, small government, cheap government, they literally rip up everything, including the kitchen, literally including the kitchen sinks, move them over to Wright Pat to build this new Wright Field where Area B of Wright-Patterson is now. So it takes a couple of years for that all to happen, but by 1927, McCook Field is closed for good. But hopefully you can get an idea of all the kind of crazy stuff that went on at McCook Field and how important it was to do all that technology development. And one piece I didn't really talk about too much is that while we were doing all that stuff, nobody else was. Because for private industry, the aviation industry had almost collapsed. Nobody was buying airplanes because there wasn't really a commercial airplane service yet. There was no Delta Airlines to buy airplanes. We hadn't really seen what it could do for the commercial sector. And there were all these surplus wartime airplanes that anybody could buy for free. That's where you see like the barnstormers and all that kind of stuff, people buying cheap airplanes. So it was really hard to make any money selling airplanes. So there was even less money, meaning no money, in technology development. So if it wasn't for McCook Field, their budget was $2 to $3 million a year, and that was it for all of that, to keep everybody paid, to keep the lights on, to do technology development. If we weren't doing that stuff, then literally nobody else in the country and very few people in the world were doing that stuff. So aviation would have been years behind where it was if it wasn't for that decade of McCook Field.